In 2027, a plane will leave Sydney, Australia, and it will not touch the ground for around 22 hours. Not a military jet, not an experimental drone, a commercial airliner carrying 238 paying passengers, burning through more than 160,000 litres of jet fuel to cross 10,000 miles of open sky without stopping. Qantas calls it Project Sunrise. Engineers call it the edge of what physics allows. And the math behind making it work is so brutal that it almost didn't. This is the story of the longest commercial flight ever attempted, and why getting a plane to stay in the air for over 20 hours turned out to be the easy part. Qantas has been obsessed with conquering distance since the 1940s. During World War II, the airline flew Catalina flying boats from Perth to Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, covering nearly 4,000 miles at 125 miles per hour. Those flights took almost 30 hours. Passengers watched the sun rise, set, and rise again. Qantas called them the double sunrise flights, and they became legend. 80 years later, the airline wanted to finish what it started. In 2017, Qantas announced Project Sunrise, a plan to fly non-stop from Sydney to both London and New York. No layovers, no connections through Singapore or Dubai. Just one takeoff and one landing, separated by roughly 22 hours of continuous flight. The idea sounded revolutionary. The problem was that no commercial aircraft on Earth could actually do it. But here is where the story gets interesting, because the solution created a paradox that nearly made the whole project impossible. The fundamental challenge of ultra-long-haul flight comes down to a single, elegant, and deeply frustrating equation. Aeronautical engineers call it the Breguet range equation, and it governs how far any aircraft can fly. The range of an airplane depends on its speed, its fuel efficiency, how aerodynamic it is, and critically, the ratio of its takeoff weight to its landing weight. That ratio is driven almost entirely by fuel. The more fuel you carry, the heavier you are at takeoff, and here is the brutal part: that relationship is logarithmic, not linear. What that means in plain language is this: if you want to fly 10% farther, you do not just add 10% more fuel, you might need 15 or 20% more, because the extra fuel is heavy and you need additional fuel just to carry the weight of that additional fuel. Every litre you add delivers less range than the litre before it. The curve flattens, the returns diminish, and at the extreme end, around the 18 to 22 hour mark, you are fighting physics for every single nautical mile. This is the fuel weight paradox, and it is the reason the standard Airbus A350-1000, which typically seats over 300 passengers, had to be radically transformed into something entirely different. To crack the 20-hour barrier, Airbus installed a massive additional fuel tank in the rear center of the aircraft, holding 20,000 extra liters. That is roughly 5,000 extra gallons of jet fuel sitting behind the passengers, but that much fuel shifts the center of gravity so dramatically that Airbus had to redesign the aircraft's entire balance management system. Regulators at the European Union Aviation Safety Agency had to certify an essentially new airframe variant. The plane earned a new designation, the A350-1000 ULR, for ultra-long range, because structurally and operationally, it is a different aircraft. And here is the cost of all that extra fuel. To compensate for the weight, Qantas had to gut the cabin. Over 300 seats became 238. That is roughly a 25% reduction in revenue-generating capacity on an airframe that costs roughly the same to purchase and maintain. Every seat that disappeared made the remaining seats more expensive. The fuel weight paradox does not just limit range, it reshapes the entire economics of the flight. So Qantas and Airbus solved the physics. They redesigned the plane, added the fuel, rebalanced the airframe, and got regulators to certify a variant that can stay airborne for up to 22 hours. Engineering problem handled. But that was the easy part, because the real limit of a 22-hour flight is not aluminum and carbon fiber, it is flesh and blood. The aircraft can handle 22 hours. The question that almost derailed Project Sunrise was whether the people inside it could. In 2019, Qantas ran 3 highly publicized research flights. A Boeing 787-9 flew from New York to Sydney and from London to Sydney, carrying up to 40 people including crew, mostly Qantas employees volunteering as test subjects alongside scientists and medical researchers. These were not commercial flights. No seats were sold. The aircraft were brand new, rerouted from Boeing's factory in Seattle to simulate Project Sunrise routes before entering regular service. Qantas invited journalists, published press releases, and openly branded them as the Project Sunrise research flights. And strapped to the heads of the pilots were electroencephalogram monitors recording their brain activity in real time. Researchers from the University of Sydney's Charles Perkins Centre and Monash University's Cooperative Research Centre for Alertness were watching every spike and dip in neural function. Meanwhile, Monash researchers also monitored crew melatonin levels before, during, and after each approximately 19-hour flight. What they found was sobering. Pilot cognitive performance degrades in non-linear ways during ultra-long flights. It is not a steady decline. Alertness drops in unpredictable waves influenced by circadian rhythm, workload changes, and even meal timing. A pilot can feel fine and still show measurable impairment on an EEG. Existing aviation fatigue rules were written for flights of 16 hours or less. No regulatory framework on Earth covered a 22-hour commercial operation. Australia's Civil Aviation Safety Authority had to build new fatigue risk management requirements from scratch, and Qantas committed to sharing the crew well-being data to help inform those new regulations. The flights will require 4 pilots rotating through shifts with dedicated crew rest compartments that are essentially hidden bedrooms built into the aircraft. Every minute of the flight plan, from departure time to meal service to lighting changes, has been engineered around human neurochemistry. This is not just a flight schedule. It is a clinical protocol, and the passengers face their own biological war. 22 hours in a pressurized metal tube at 39,000 feet takes a measurable toll on the human body. But the A350 has an advantage here. Its composite fuselage allows the cabin to be pressurized to the equivalent of 6,000 feet, compared to 8,000 feet on older aluminum aircraft. That difference matters. Lower cabin altitude means higher blood oxygen, less dehydration, and significantly less fatigue. Qantas went further. The cabin includes a purpose-built well-being zone between premium economy and economy, a space for stretching and movement that exists on no other commercial aircraft. The lighting system features 12 unique scenes, including a dynamic sunrise sequence that rolls from the front of the cabin to the rear, and a sunset mode with moonlight and slow-moving clouds, all grounded in circadian rhythm science and calibrated to help passengers adjust to their destination time zone before they land. Meals are timed to destination time zones, not departure zones. Even the wine list was evaluated for weight. That detail sounds absurd until you learn the industry rule. Every single kilogram removed from a commercial aircraft saves roughly $100 to $200 in fuel costs per year. On a plane that flies to the razor edge of its range, a heavier bottle of wine is not a catering choice. It is an engineering decision. Every overhead bin, every tray table, every gram of the aircraft was scrutinized in what insiders call the weight war. And this is where Project Sunrise hits its most dangerous turbulence, because none of these solutions are free. 238 seats instead of over 300 means Qantas needs dramatically higher revenue per passenger to break even. Industry estimates place economy tickets between $2,500 and $3,500. Business class could run $8,000 to $12,000. First class suites over $20,000. For context, a one-stop economy fare from Sydney to London through Singapore typically costs between $800 and $1,500. Qantas is betting that passengers will pay double or triple for the privilege of saving roughly 4 hours of total travel time. That is the core economic gamble. 4 hours of your life valued at over $1,000. For a corporate traveler on an expense account, maybe. For a family of 4, the math does not work, and Qantas cannot fill 238 seats with only corporate travelers. Meanwhile, Singapore Airlines already flies 19 hours non-stop from Singapore to New York on its own ultra-long-range A350 variant and charges a steep premium for the privilege. But Singapore's flight is shorter, the aircraft carries more passengers per route, and the economics are more forgiving. Qantas is attempting something longer, more expensive, and more logistically fragile than anything the industry has ever sustained commercially. The airline has ordered 12 of these aircraft, 12 bets, at a list price of roughly $360 million each, that the market for 22-hour flights exists at scale. If the load factors fall below projections, if fuel prices spike, if a recession dampens premium travel demand, those 12 planes become 12 very expensive problems. So when the first Qantas A350-1000 ULR lifts off from Sydney sometime in 2027, it will not just be carrying passengers across 10,000 miles of sky. It will be carrying a 90-year-old dream that started with flying boats and 2 sunrises, an equation that says every extra mile costs exponentially more than the last, a regulatory framework that had to be invented from nothing, and an economic bet that 4 hours of saved time is worth billions in investment. Project Sunrise is not just the longest flight in history, it is a test of whether the absolute edge of what is physically possible can also be the edge of what is financially sustainable. Because in aviation, the hardest barrier to break was never the sound barrier, it was the profit barrier. And 22 hours in the sky is where physics, biology, and economics all collide at once. If you found this fascinating, subscribe for more stories where engineering meets the impossible.